Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here. And this week's deep dive is going to be on the editorial process. And I want to go through and talk about the editorial process. And the reason why I want to talk about this is that, as you know, we just went through a presidential election here in the United States, and obviously other countries have their own elections as well. And we obviously, in the run up to this, saw an absolute ton of disinformation, a lot of real time information flying around. And the argument essentially has been that essentially the editorial process has been killed. Real time and immediate information on platforms like Twitter or other social media platforms are there. And Elon Musk recently tweeted out, "You are the media now." And so that really got me thinking about, okay, let's look at the editorial process. And full disclosure, as I've written articles for Forbes and other publishers, I've had editors, I've had this process, and there are pros and cons to both. But I want to make the case for the editorial process while being honest to everything. And so with that, let's go through some of the ground rules. And for the record, if you are listening to this on the radio or you're listening to this on podcast form, you might want to go check out the YouTube video because I've laid all of this out in video form, with images and pros and cons, all that kind of stuff. So just a heads up to you. But with that, as always, I want to talk about the ground rules first because, as always, this is not political. It really isn't. I like to say cybersecurity is agnostic to politics, but we're not immune from it. And while we're talking about the editorial process, I think it's also important to note that I do not care what you believe. You might be, basically drinking the Kool-Aid for Trump or Harris or whatever you believe. That's not the point of this. This is essentially going to be an analysis of basically real-time information delivered on platforms like social media versus the standard editorial process. We are going to go through the good and bad of both of them because the final point here is I want to be 100% honest to both sides. I want to talk about the pros and the cons of essentially all of this. And so with that, let's start with the social media side of this, the pros and cons of the real-time delivery information. Now, first things first, obviously one of the pros of this is speed and immediacy. Stuff is published instantly, live updates. This can be really good for things like hurricanes. We saw obviously, real-time updates on Twitter and other platforms, aka X, when let's say the recent hurricane that came through that ravaged Asheville, North Carolina, et cetera, et cetera. We saw a lot of that. But the con to that is accuracy. Without that kind of oversight, we essentially saw a whole bunch of disinformation. I did an entire segment on that where people were putting out demonstrably fake pictures and information about bodies floating everywhere, or this little girl holding a puppy that was clearly AI generated but made the rounds on social media. It is very easy to insert misinformation or disinformation into that real-time feed, if you will. With that, social media also, as a pro, offers wider accessibility. Anybody with internet essentially can get access to this because it's free to sign up for Twitter, Facebook, whatever that is. But that also comes the con is lack of verification because anybody can sign up and sign up anonymously. Essentially, what you have is unverified information. Is this actually happening in Asheville, South or North Carolina during that hurricane, or is this something that's fake that is designed to basically either pull at your heartstrings or explode the issue, or blame, let's say, the Biden administration or Trump or whatever for this, depending on what it is. So with that lack of verification, also again, is really, really very easy to put disinformation or misinformation into those real-time feeds. Now, one of the pros, or one of the other pros of social media in terms of real-time delivery, is on-the-ground reporting, right? So if I'm in that, North Carolina area that got ravaged and I'm on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, I can put out real-time information to say, hey, my block was destroyed. I'm fine, whatever that is. I can give an eyewitness account and I would obviously be on the ground if I'm assuming I can verify myself. The thing, though, is that we also have a lack of expertise. Journalists tend to be trained. They tend to understand objectivity and put their biases aside, ideally. And I know some of you are rolling your eyes at that, but we'll get to that. And so, by virtue of that, we may have a lack of depth or context to a situation, which therefore could potentially spin a situation one way or the other when the intent may not be that. The other pro that we have on social media is we have a diversity of perspectives. So by virtue of that, anybody can get on social media from any type of background and actually start talking or communicating regarding their experience, whatever that is. I think honestly, that's a really good thing. But the other side of that is the creation of echo chambers because algorithms can promote posts within like-minded groups, therefore reinforcing bias. And that is one of the big issues that we actually have with this because you might have, or you might be reading something in real time on the fly that is disinformation, but it confirms something you believe about someone else or something else. And while that may be demonstrably false, you believe it's right. You feel it's right. And that's one of the big issues that we've got. Now, one of the other big pros of social media in real-time information delivery is the global reach. These things can go viral. The algorithms to that point can push these things out, and a much wider audience to the tune of millions, as opposed to, let's say, hundreds of thousands that might read a publication, can also start seeing these kinds of things. But this is also what allows misinformation and disinformation to spread like wildfire. And what happens is when it is actually fact-checked retroactively, hours later, maybe a day later, not everybody gets that memo. And so by virtue of that, oftentimes people can be left with essentially a false understanding or assumption of what's going on. Now, another benefit that social media has is its interactive format, right? I mean, it basically allows for immediate engagement, feedback, whatever that is. You might not want to read a million opinions, but you're going to get a million opinions, on social media. And so by virtue of that, the balance of that is the reliability of these sources. Users can post anonymously, for example. So judging credibility, while somebody may sound authoritative, they may simply not be. And there's a lot of people out there that will Google something and say, well, now I'm an expert in this, when Google is telling them one thing or the other. Maybe it's a biased source. The algorithms in Google have pushed them one way or the other, or they've gone to a chat GPT to ask the question and chat GPT hallucinates on them, but it sounds authoritative. And so that reliability obviously is a huge issue. Now, one of the things that I think kind of is in the pro category, but I think it could go both ways, is that social media in real-time information delivery essentially means unfiltered content. So those lack of restrictions, that lack of editorial process, means that you can cover controversial topics. Now, I think you can do this in traditional editorial-based media as well, but it's very easy to put out basically any controversial topic immediately at will as you're thinking about it. But the other side of that is the misinformation side, the potential to harm others. So, for example, we've seen a massive rise in hate speech, for example. And then obviously the question is, okay, well, what is hate speech, et cetera, et cetera. But it's that which would be derogatory, against another person, another group, another class, whatever that is. That can obviously cause harm, again, if it's reinforced by that confirmation bias. There's no process. Again, remember, there's no process to vet the information that's being put out in real time. And so there's no real fact check to any of this. Now, the other positive that social media has, and again, we'll get to the editorial process because there are cons to that too, but personalization is definitely a pro as well. So you can basically choose who you want to follow, tailored updates, et cetera, et cetera. But the issue with that, again, is you're going to basically follow people that have your viewpoint. If you're on the left, you're going to follow left people, unless you like to just basically poke the bear and follow right people just to mess with them. Same on the right, trolling the left, et cetera, et cetera. But you have the ability to tailor that. That's one of the actual detriments I've seen since Elon Musk has taken over Twitter, is that my For You feed is now full of people with political bias I've never even heard of. When previous to Elon Musk taking over and changing all the algorithms, I had a pretty nicely curated feed, of news sources from around the world, talking on a myriad of different topics: geopolitics, technology, security, whatever it is. Something I'm rebuilding on Blue Sky right now. But that personalization is good. The other side of it, though, and the con of this, is information overload, right? I mean, you can basically either just get burned out of all of this, or there might be so much information you're not necessarily sure how relevant or pertinent it is compared to other things. In other words, this might be a low priority thing on the grand scale of things, but it's just caught in the weeds, and so now you're giving it a greater priority than it should be. In other words, you're playing whack-a-mole with prioritization here, and that's a huge issue. And the other big side, and I'd say real pro of real-time information, is cost efficiency, right? Anybody can publish for free. I can literally go on X or Twitter right now and say whatever I want and it's going to get out to the world, whoever decides to read it, spread it, share it, whatever, believe it, et cetera, et cetera. So that really lowers the barrier for entry. Whereas in an editorial process, I mean, you have to be vetted, as, let's say, an expert. Like, I can't simply just, go to Forbes and say, hey, I want to publish on anything if I'm Nick the bus driving dude and I actually want to talk about cybersecurity. I have to show that I'm a cybersecurity expert, that I've been vetted for that. So the information that I'm going to be delivering, statistically speaking, is more reliable. Now, the other side, or the con to cost efficiency would be things like shorter attention spans. Content on Twitter, aka X, is short, right? You get like 140 characters or 30 characters or like 5,000 characters if you pay for it and all of that. And so by virtue of that, a lot of the information that you're going to get oftentimes can lack depth, lack a full understanding of context when you're just trying to hit and run. Not to mention the written word can be interpreted in multiple ways, especially if there's no process to really hone that to make it more accurate. That's one thing that I've noticed over the years that I've improved on by virtue of having editors that I will debate with, because aside from the fact that they're keeping me honest with the fact checking and statements that I am making to show that I actually have evidence to back up what I'm saying, there's oftentimes discussions on, is this the point you really want to make? Like, this could go either way, and it really has improved my ability to hone my writing in that sense. I give editors all the credit in the world for that as well. So that is an issue. Now, with that, let's talk about traditional media. Let's talk about that traditional editorial process. And now there are a lot of pros, but there are cons with that as well. So the first one is verification standards, right? I mean, obviously they're fact checked. I have to be accurate. I've had several conversations where my editors have come back. Ben, I'm looking at you, and Ben, if you're watching this, you know who you are. Basically saying, is this really the best source you've got? Do you have more accurate information, or et cetera, et cetera? It's keeping me honest. But the downside of that, obviously, is that takes time, right? If you're trying to respond in a disaster through an editorial process, it's very difficult. And so where's the balance there, right? Real-time information, but disinformation is super easy to just insert into the live stream. Or do we take time to actually get accurate information out? And I would argue that really depends on the situation. Most things are not emergency situations like an incoming hurricane, here's where to go. Things can be slowed a little bit to ensure that they're accurate. Now, the other side of the editorial process, which is definitely a pro, is experienced journalists. Journalists are actually trained. And so by virtue of that, essentially, like the Forbes of the world, my publisher, or take your pick, tend to want subject matter experts that know what they're talking about on this. Nobody is asking me, Nick, can you talk about underwater basket weaving or write an article on that? Because I have no experience on that. It's the same with like automotive repair. I like cars, I like driving them, but I'm not a mechanic. But I can write on cybersecurity. I have training, a background in that. I'm a subject matter expert. I travel globally to speak on this. And so by virtue of that, it speaks to the experience that you'll get essentially from, let's say, a journalist that has a specialization in one thing or the other. The downside to that is the limited voices, right? Traditional media can essentially have potential biases or omit perspectives of certain groups. Now, I will say that I think that having the editorial process does tend to strip out a good chunk of bias, only because if you have a reputation to hold up as a traditional media source, let's say like the Washington Post, et cetera, you're going to want to vet that information, more so than it would be like, just on a real time, just vomiting it out on a Twitter. Now, that's not to say that false information can't get through, but it's statistically much, much lower, which speaks to my next point, which is the credibility and trustworthiness of the editorial process. That is a vast pro compared to social media in real time. Now, that said, the cost of access to that information can be tough. Where Twitter is free and anybody can read anything, you might have to pay a subscription after you've read your 5 free articles from whatever, major publication, and now you're paying for subscriptions, all that kind of stuff. So that is kind of a higher barrier for entry as well. Now, that said, in the editorial process, because we're taking our time to get it right, another pro is context and depth. That's something that 140 characters or 300 characters or whatever on Twitter simply can't do. We go through rounds of editing. We provide context. These are the discussions I'm having with my editors at any publication I've ever written for to say, okay, let's add meat to this. Let's understand this at a much deeper level. My articles would be longer. Obviously, they'd be 1,000 words as opposed to 140 characters. But the downside to that is potentially like a risk of censorship. Editorial oversight could filter out those controversial or sensitive topics that anybody can just tweet out at a moment's notice. But again, it's an oversight thing. Now, the other side of it is that, and I think this is also a big pro, is that there is legal accountability in the editorial process. Essentially, the Washington Post of the world are held to higher legal standards. And so if they're putting out something that is, let's say, demonstrably false, they're going to get sued. The whole point of having an editor, or I should say, not the whole point, but one of the big points of having an editor, in my experience, is that the editor is looking at this to say, you know what, we have to indemnify ourselves as well. This has to be accurate. This has to speak to the evidence of the situation, and therefore my logic has to meet the evidence, et cetera, et cetera. And so that is good, whereas you can just put out anything and you might get sued for defamation or libel or whatever it is on Twitter. But it's a much different legal standard for an editorial based system. So by virtue of that, one of the cons is influence of advertisers, right? Because essentially you can also have ads that look like articles, that seem like it's, oh, we're comparing one thing to another when it's actually a paid advertisement. And I think that is one of the downsides when we see those kinds of articles, because it looks authoritative from an authoritative source, but unless you're really looking for that sponsored logo, or like, this is a paid ad but looks like an article, those are things that I think are a huge issue. One of the other benefits, I think, of the editorial process is the long form analysis, right? We can explore topics. I've read some articles that might take me a sitting or two because it's 3,000 to 5,000 words long, but it's nuanced. It's accurate to the situation. You get many perspectives from the people or entities involved in the situation. I really actually enjoy that because I feel like I have a greater context for the situation at hand. That downside to that is the speed side. There's a lack of immediacy there. And so you can't really have real-time updates in the same way you could on a Twitter. But again, you're cutting down on that disinformation side. You're ensuring accuracy in a way that a social media platform simply cannot do that when anybody can publish anything. The other side of it, on the pro column for editorial, is the institutional resources, right? You have teams that can go out and investigate. I mean, look at Woodward and Bernstein, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, even before Trump was around, I mean, they're investigative journalists that have taken down politicians on both political sides, and those kinds of things. Not to mention, you've got the editing side of this. You also have a lot more resources for better multimedia presentations, all this kind of stuff, because there's going to be more depth than you simply, tweeting out 200 characters or whatever. But that said, that also can generate perceived bias, especially if you're being told that all of this is agenda driven. And so if you're looking at this, and this is one of the things we have, is like, and Donald Trump, to be fair, says this all the time, oh, the failing New York Times or this or that, giving the perception that there is a lack of editorial process, or the editorial process is completely slanted. That has, quite frankly, not been my experience as I've been publishing. It's more on the accuracy side. Now, the difference is you are going to get opinion pieces in major publications in the same way that if you were to turn on, Fox News or CNN, in the evening, you're going to get a pundit. Sean Hannity, for example, on Fox News is not a journalist. He's a pundit. He has an opinion, and he's sharing that opinion in the same way that Rachel Maddow is. Now, both of them are trained in various things, but at the end of the day, it's punditry. And so I think that is something that is a huge issue. Now, I think one of the big benefits of the editorial process is the oversight that we essentially get with this. It reduces sensationalism. It prioritizes fact-based reporting. It essentially ensures that we're getting straight to the point, and this is not a sky-falling situation. It's information delivered, and you get to interpret that at a fact-based platform. The other side of that, though, is that it is resource intensive, which means that obviously it's going to take longer to get out. but the sustainability in long term means that a New York Times or Washington Post or Forbes or whatever is going to have higher operating costs, which could harm them in the long run, as opposed to just blurting things out. That said, I think accuracy is the most important thing, when it comes to information delivery, not speed. And so, here we are. Now, that said, and then the last pro I want to talk about really is the regulated content standards that the editorial process brings. There are standards for delivering information, and therefore it kills misinformation very heavily. Now, there are things that any process, any vetting could potentially miss. There's going to be stuff that, let's say, the Washington Post, Forbes, whatever, gets wrong, in the same way that I could publish something that is inaccurate. But with that oversight, there is a process for correction. They print retractions, they print corrections. This is not something that you see anywhere on social media. Who is putting out disinformation and then 3 days later saying, you know what, my bad, guys? It happens next to none. Especially if it's disinformation where the intent is to intentionally misinform the public. Nobody's ever going to write a retraction for that. There's no process, there's no vetting. It's one individual person or a group with that negative intent. Whereas in the editorial process, I'm going to get smacked upside the head virtually by my editors if something gets through that. I actually had one of those issues years ago, back in, like, I want to say 2018 or so, with that, where we were able to correct that issue once that was there. And that was very important to me, to be as accurate as I humanly can, which is why I want to go through the pros and cons with you of both of these. And so while we have regulated content standards, the reflexive con on the editorial process is I think the difficulty reaching younger audiences. We have been growing essentially social media. And when you're looking at, let's say, anybody under the age of 25 or 30, they essentially are ensconced in social media. It is the primary information delivery system. Studies have shown that even the older generations, when Facebook came on the scene, more people are getting their news from Facebook than actually seeking out actual publications. And by virtue of that, we saw a massive explosion in disinformation. Foreign intelligence agencies were all over that as well. And this is the ecosystem that the youth is in right now. They're not reading traditional news sources, even though those news sources are going to be vastly more accurate in any kind of comparison, any kind of study, and definitely over time because of that vetting process. But when you want information now, you're going to social media. And honestly, it is a crapshoot because there is a ton of disinformation and misinformation out there. And so that really leads us, to the next core thing, which is truly better. And so with that, a quick recap: speed versus accuracy. And I think that is one of the big things. Social media is going to rip it out faster, but it's not going to be fact checked. It's not going to be nearly as reliable. And I would rather take a step back, breathe for a moment, especially, let's say, in a long-term, potentially precarious information, and get accurate data. I mean, think about it on a battlefield, right? You're getting stuff in real time. And if the information you're getting on the battlefield is inaccurate or has been inserted into your communication systems by the enemy, you're acting on false information. Whereas sometimes you've just got to take a step back and plan slightly, even in a combat situation, to ensure that what you're doing is accurate. You've got to step back and breathe. Speed isn't always going to be the winner. On top of it, it's diversity versus consistency. So you're going to get broader perspective, of voices on essentially social media. I think that is a good thing in the long run. But the point is that one of the other things we have to balance with that is the consistency of this. We're not in the editorial process prone to things like hyperbole, whereas a diversity of thought will breed hyperbole, which potentially breeds misinformation or disinformation as well. Also, it's accessibility versus cost. I think social media wins this all day, every day, in the sense that social media obviously, is free. You can sign up. You can see an entire slew of thoughts. The only downside of that is the cost side, which is on the traditional media side. You have to pay for a subscription, but the balance to me always is I would rather have accurate information, and by virtue of that, I would rather pay for a subscription to ensure that I'm getting accurate information versus seeing, let's say, 20% accurate, 80% misinformation, or 80% accurate, 20% information. I'd rather be as close to 100% accurate as I possibly can be. which leads us to the depth versus brevity, right? I mean, if you have the ability with the editorial process to really lay out proper context, lay out evidence, lay out your reasoning and your logic as to why, with evidence-based logic, why one thing is good or bad, or one thing is happening or not, or which direction we should go, it's a more informed opinion. And oftentimes it's coming from a subject matter expert as opposed to the quick 140 character tweet, just blasting it out. It's prone to hyperbole because everybody's trying to get noticed. And so during the election, I would see disinformation of like, oh, this state was won when it's not, it hasn't even been called yet, et cetera, et cetera. Now we all know how the election went and who won, but in the real time of that, imagine being a Harris supporter, and hearing immediately, oh yes, well, Harris won Georgia and Florida and all of this because somebody's trying to get out there and and spread this, and the algorithms take it and spread it like wildfire, which is stuff that we were seeing when in fact Harris lost Georgia and Florida to Trump, right? So I think that's important. And at the end of the day, I don't think speed is better than accuracy. Accuracy and facts should outweigh absolutely everything. And studies have consistently shown that the editorial process kills misinformation and disinformation overwhelmingly. It's a second set of eyes that are trained to vet. It's coming from a subject matter expert. The accuracy of what I'm going to write in an article for Forbes is going to be much more accurate than somebody that Googles, let's say, cybersecurity and puts out an opinion that seems or sounds authoritative when quite frankly it's not. I had this exact problem with Mike Lindell's cybersecurity symposium, which I sat through the entire thing and wrote an article about it, essentially laying out why there really wasn't any kind of evidence there. And I had an editor that went through it to ensure that I was accurate, and that's what we're talking about. The information I delivered as a result of that reporting, I know is accurate to what was actually there because I'm a subject matter expert. I have vetting on it. My context is accurate. And while it didn't basically get published like seconds after the cyber symposium was over, it was published a day or two after with that accuracy. And I think that's more important because if we are going to get out of disinformation bubbles and misinformation bubbles, this is how we do it. I think it's so unbelievably important to understand that this is what we're talking about. And so with that, I don't care, again, what you believe. You might say, Nick, you're an idiot. I'm going to use social media all day long. Just understand that your information ingestion is not nearly going to be as accurate as mine or anybody else that is looking at the editorial process to look at fact-based information first above speed. And that's not a slight on you. That simply is what it is. That is the evidence. And so by virtue of that, thank you very much. Please feel free to, like and subscribe, et cetera, et cetera. But this has been your deep dive of the week. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please attempt to stay private while getting the most accurate information you possibly can. Thanks, everybody.